Okay, so welcome to part three of our Tolkien lectures that are focusing specifically on the inspirations of J.R.R. Tolkien. You might hear me refer to him as John Ronald or Ronald tonight, and that is mostly because that is what he went by to his friends and to his family. So if you hear me say Ronald or John Ronald or Tolkien, I'm referring to the same person. So we're going to start tonight on a discussion specifically about Tolkien's academic career. And this is going to be something that is quite a bit more central to his life than a lot of the people might think. If you read Lord of the Rings, or if you read The Hobbit, or if you read The Silmarillion, you're going to get these epic works of fantasy that have deep histories and very long descriptions and epic pieces of poetry and things of this nature. But this doesn't necessarily give away the fact that Tolkien was not a full-time writer. In fact, he was a little bit of a reluctant writer in some aspects. And his day job, if you wanted to call it that, was being an academic in universities. And he was a professor for most of his adult life. And we're going to look tonight at how that chosen profession is going to not only impact how he wrote and what he wrote, but in fact is going to directly spur what he wrote and how he wrote. Because the love that Tolkien had for studying language and for examining different comparative pieces of literature is very, very deep. And this is what's going to foster his creative spirit. So if we go all the way back to when Tolkien first started school, this would have been in the years 1906, 1907, right around in there. He got into a fairly good school. It was not necessarily the most elite school in the country, but he went to a school called King Edward's, which was in Birmingham, which is in the middle part of England. And unfortunately, the building that we still have today from King Edward's is just the entryway. And today, this particular building is actually a small museum that houses artifacts from people that were at King Edward's that died in World War I. The original building that Tolkien would have been in when he was a young schoolboy has since been demolished, and another building now sits on top of it. And if you're wondering whether or not Tolkien liked the new building as opposed to the old one, you could probably guess. He did not necessarily have the highest opinions of the school built on top of the school where he went. So this entryway to King Edward School is actually not even on the original site anymore. It's moved to a new location, and they dismantled the entryway basically brick by brick and moved it to this new location and then put it all back together. And again, now it's a museum that you can go visit, and you'll see some artifacts that actually relate to both Tolkien, especially some of Tolkien's friends who died in World War I. If you're more interested about that particular material, you can check out part 2 on the event of me putting up all of the VODs. So, all right, so this is King Edward's, and what's interesting here is right off the bat, one might expect Tolkien to be some sort of stellar student, but he actually failed the first entrance exam to get into King Edward's. This is partially because his mom was having to try to do all of her schooling herself. So for the first few years of Tolkien and his brother Hilary's education, his mom was trying to do her best to teach them. And while she was a good teacher, this was not necessarily the same level of rigor that they would have had in a school system. And it takes Tolkien twice to get into King Edward's, which is a quite good school. And he ends up staying there for a little while, and then due to tuition issues gets taken out and put in a much poorer school and then ends up coming back later after his mom is going to be able to secure some additional funds to pay for the tuition. Hilary, his younger brother, is going to end up at King Edward's a couple of years later, and this is going to be where they spend most of their early school years. Now, once he actually gets into school, he does show quite a bit of acumen, especially in the fields of reading and literature and language. By December of 2003, at the midterm breaks or so, his teachers are going to send letters to his mom telling him how good of a student that he is, especially that he was reading very far beyond his years. But this doesn't mean that he was necessarily the most focused student. By the time it got around for him to start applying for university, he had been somewhat distracted, but there are some pieces of justification that we can add to that. Of course, his mother passes away, and he has to bounce around between living facilities. He moves several times very in rapid succession. He, for a period of time, basically doesn't live in the same place for more than a year for 3 or 4 years in a row. And this is obviously going to have a level of impact on him. So when he applies for Oxford and tries to take the entrance exam for Oxford, he doesn't actually get in. So what is he doing to try to brush up on this? Well, he's really going to start devouring books, and he just absolutely goes crazy with the reading. And we talked in part 2 about some really important teachers that were going to encourage his reading, going to allow him to borrow books. We talked about Brewerton and Carrie Gilson, 2 very important teachers in his early life. But around this time, he's also going to start branching out and reading things for himself. Specifically, right around this time in 1907 or 1908, he's going to read Beowulf for the first time. And this is a very important moment in his life. He's going to read it in a modern translation, but he's also going to read it in what was basically an interlinear Old English. So he's getting exposure to the original Anglo-Saxons verse for this stuff. So for those of you that are not intimately familiar with Beowulf or just sort of know it in passing, this is a late 10th or early 11th century document that is around 3,100 lines long. It's written in what's called alliterative verse, which is a type of rhyme scheme where the rhyming is internal to the line. You will have a beginning sound or sometimes a middle sound that repeats multiple times inside of a line. And this is a little bit different than what you might be familiar with stuff like sonnets, where the rhyme scheme is based on the ending word. But this is going to be very fascinating for a young Ronald, because he had exposure to Shakespeare and had exposure to the Middle English material. I'm sorry, the more Renaissance English material, but he was almost immediately taken by the older stuff, the Middle English and the Old English. And Beowulf has an oral history that goes back as far as perhaps even the 700s. So this is one of the oldest pieces that is in existence of actual Anglo-Saxon writing. And this is going to really key in Tolkien to this idea of the history of England, which we talked about rather extensively in part 1. And it's also around this time that he's going to start looking for other pieces of work that fit this sort of same mold. He wants to read more older English works, and he's going to run into Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a piece of Middle English writing that was written probably in the late 14th century. It's also a long series of what we would call stanzas or poems. It's an epic poem. And it's also written in alliterative verse, similar to Beowulf. And this is something that really gets Tolkien very excited. He had already been exposed to Arthurian legend from his mother, who had let him read some of the translations of stuff that she had in her personal library. And Sir Gawain is a really important piece of epic literature, and just recently made into a movie. I don't know if you all have seen that. It was also written by the same person that wrote another piece of literature called The Pearl. The Pearl is another piece of, again, it's the same sort of thing as the 14th century, late 14th century alliterative verse epic poem. It's a little bit more religious in nature, but it's absolutely something that Tolkien keyed in on. And these early exposures to pieces of literature like this are going to lead him to looking for the history of things, especially histories of languages. And this is going to open the world to him because, of course, Anglo-Saxon is not what we would necessarily consider an incredibly ancient language. It is old, anything 2,000 years old is old, but this isn't where it started. So he starts wanting to read where things came from, and he starts being very interested in the roots of language and how different languages relate to each other. And he starts figuring out that he doesn't necessarily want to just always rely on a translation. Sometimes he's going to do his best to read things in the original languages, but that's going to be tough for him because he doesn't necessarily have access to all of the material that you would need to learn these ancient languages. For example, he had already read versions of the story of Sigurd and Fafnir from Andrew Lang's Red Fairy book, which his mother had supplied for him when he was very young, but he wants to read it in the original language, or as far back as a language that he could get, and that's basically Old Norse. And he starts trying to teach himself these languages, but being who he was in his position, he didn't necessarily have a lot of money. And this is going to put him at a disadvantage because he can't just go buy books. He has to rely on what he can find in the library at his school or what he can borrow off of professors. And this was rather extensive, but he's, again, going through books incredibly rapidly. And he has this sort of voracious desire to read and piece the puzzle together. And he ends up having to buy whatever he can basically secondhand. One of the things that he does around this time, around 1908, 1909, is scrapes together as much money as he possibly can because one of his friends in school had some German philology books that they wanted to sell. And these were something that he just absolutely wanted to have. He wanted to have these books that would explain how German was related to other languages and how other languages borrowed from German. And this is going to lead him backwards to an older Germanic language, which is Gothic, the language of the Goths. If you know anything about the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Gothic people were a group of people that came off of the steppe region in Central Asia and moved over to Europe during the period of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And he's going to get intensely fascinated with Gothic. And he ends up buying a Gothic primer. Well, a primer is just a book that basically gives you simple grammar and the rules of how to speak a language and how to read a language. But the copy that he got was written by this gentleman, Joseph Wright. Joseph Wright was a very sort of well-known philologist. He, at the time, was an active teacher of English and German philology at Oxford. And the Gothic primer that he purchased, that Ronald purchased, was going to set off just a flurry of activity, mentally speaking, because the Gothic language didn't have a full vocabulary. We know a lot of the old Gothic language, and we know now more than we did at that time. But there were substantial gaps in the oldest version of the Gothic language. And what Ronald started to do, just as a mental exercise, was that he tried to fill in the words that were missing. And in such a way, what he wanted to recreate was his own version of a Neo-Gothic language. And this is one of the first times that he starts really working to apply his knowledge of language to a creative endeavor. Around the same time, I know that somebody might recognize his love of creative languages. Around this time, he's actually going to start working with some of his cousins. The Enclendons were a family that related to the Suffields that were part of his extended cousin family on his mother's side, and he had a couple of cousins, especially Mary, that were interested in making up their own play languages. And this is going to be something that is taken initially as just a bit of a pastime, but does turn into something that Tolkien ends up putting a lot of effort into. And this is actually going to distract from his actual studies when he's supposed to be doing other sorts of assignments and finds himself working on trying to recreate Gothic. He's also going to start learning other languages as a way to sort of fill in his broader concept of what language looks like. During this time, he's going to learn Esperanto, which is a language that had been proposed as a universal language. And he was interested in how the language of Esperanto was created as a way to try to not necessarily choose one linguistic background to base all of the words. Esperanto is definitely more Western than it is Eastern language-wise, but it was an interesting thing that Tolkien enjoyed, and this was just going to add to his larger collection of knowledge. During this time period, he's also going to start working on speaking in public, and he joins the debate team, and he even starts giving lectures at his grade school by 1910, and this is a fairly remarkable moment. He's not necessarily the best student when it comes to turning things in on time and getting your grades in and getting your work done, but he's obviously a bright person. And this is going to be something that gets recognized by his faculty members and his people that are surrounding him, especially his friends. And if you want to know more about his friends, I would encourage you to check out part 2 if you missed that. Now, when it comes to college time or university time, he didn't have the money that he needed to go to college. And this is going to prevent him from going to the fanciest of colleges. But he knows that he wants to end up in the Oxford group. And he applies to several and is not necessarily going to be able to afford any of this stuff. But he does end up getting what's called an open classical exhibition to go to Exeter. Now, Exeter is a great school. I actually considered going there myself. This is a picture of the sort of the quad or the courtyard at Exeter. Tried to find the oldest picture that I could find that gave you a good sense of what sort of college this was, or university, right? College and university are slightly different in the UK than they are in the United States, so I really should refer to it as university. I'm just sort of stuck calling it college because of my United States background. But Exeter was a fine school. However, if we're just being honest, it was a school that wasn't purely designed for the richest and the most well-to-do individuals. Exeter had many more students that were from a middle-class background, and this is going to be something that Tolkien actually appreciates. There are going to be many of his fellows that are quite better off than him when it comes to finances, and he is going to struggle financially at Exeter, even though at the time he was getting a fairly decent scholarship from his classical exhibition, which was about £60 a year. When he gets to Exeter, though, he's going to get more access. And getting access to the libraries in the Oxford system, he's going to have just so many more opportunities here. And one of the most important books that he's going to run across during this time is what's called the Kalevala. The original version that he reads is a translation by this gentleman. This is William Forsell Kirby, who lived from 1844 to 1912. He was an English writer and did the translation. He was also an entomologist, which is where he did most of his classical work, botany and entomology. But just so happened to know the Finnish language and was able to translate the Kalevala into English. The version that Tolkien first read was what was called the Everyman translation. So Kirby did the translation with the approach that everybody could be able to pick up the Kalevala and just sort of go with it. Now, if you want to know what the Kalevala actually is, this gentleman here, this is Elias Lönnrot, and Lönnrot was a Finnish folklorist, and he spent a decent portion of his adult academic career making trips into the Finnish countryside. Lönnrot lived from 1802 to 1884, to put him in context. And for, again, most of his adult life, what he went around doing was collecting different stories of Finnish folklore. And this was in the period of time in the 1800s where Finland was part of Russia. And one of the goals of Lönnrot was to produce a body of mythology and folklore that would help foster a sense of Finnish identity. This is happening quite a bit in other parts of Europe. If you're familiar with things like Grimm's fairy tales in Germany, this is the same sort of idea, where nationalism is driving academic work. And Lönnrot's collection of the Kalevala is still one of the most important collections of Finnish mythology that is in existence. And you can still buy a copy of that today if you wanted to go find it. You can still buy a copy of Kirby's translation if you are so interested. There have been ones since then that are larger and annotated and things like that give you background if you're not completely familiar with the story or the world. But the Kalevala is going to have a really, really big impact on Tolkien. He's going to read that in the early part of 1911. This is right after he starts at Exeter. And within a year, he is going to find everything that he can about the Finnish language, and he's going to start teaching himself Finnish so that he can read the Kalevala in the original language. And by 1912, he had got to the point where he knew enough of the Finnish language that he could. And this is an important moment for him because he had been very, very influenced on the Gothic language. And this had a big impact on his life. And he had spent years at this point sort of filling in his Gothic language. And he's not done creatively with the Gothic language. That comes back around later on. But his love of Finnish, especially the way that the Finnish language sounded, he was very impressed with the beauty of the rolling vowels and the repetitive syllabication of a lot of the words. This is going to be something that he finds very pleasing, and he's going to abandon his work on creating Neo-Gothic, and he's going to start working on a new language that's based on Finnish. And this is going to one day be the language of the High Elves, which is called Quenya. So if you read any of the Lord of the Rings stuff or in the Silmarillion and you see the passages written in High Elven, the language of the High Elves, or the Quenya, is based on the real world language of Finnish. So one of the other things that's going to be just absolutely amazing for him when he gets to Exeter is that he can take classes that were taught by Joseph Wright. So this is the gentleman that had written the Gothic primer that first got him into Gothic in the first place. And the particular class that Wright was teaching was a class called Comparative Philology. So this is comparing how languages originate and how they compare to each other on a fundamental building block sort of level. And Wright immediately recognizes Tolkien's skill in this area and was very impressed by the amount of work that he had already managed to do outside of class on his own. And it's going to be Wright that is going to push him into learning Welsh, which is going to be a language that stays with Tolkien for the rest of his life. He ends up teaching Welsh a little bit later at the University of Leeds, and the language of the Sylvan Elves, not the High Elves, but actually one of the more commonly spoken Elven languages in Middle Earth, is based on Welsh. So this particular language is called Sindarin. So if you've ever seen reference to something in Sindarin instead of Quenya, the Sindarin Elven language is based on Welsh, because this is something that Tolkien already had an interest in going all the way back to when he was very young and saw Welsh on train cars driving by his grandfather's house. So all of these different themes are ones that are going to start during his academic career that are going to show up later when he starts doing his fictional writing career. Now, 1913 is going to bring him into connection with a few other very important works that are going to be very, very influential for him, and that is the poetic and the prose Edda. So the Edda is a collection of Icelandic stories, and they date from around the 900s up to about the 1100s from Iceland, and most of them are written in Old Norse. And these are also usually written in poem form or verse form in the original versions, and the verses are going to follow the same alliterative verse pattern that Tolkien was already very familiar with from things like Sir Gawain, the Pearl, and Beowulf. So this is going to have a big impact on him as well, because he sort of starts devouring all of these stories. And there's a particular portion of the Icelandic sagas that's called the Voluspa, and that one particularly is very influential because Tolkien lifts a lot of the names of his dwarves from that work. So if you read especially The Hobbit and you know the list of dwarves that are in the company of Thorin, a lot of those names originally come from Icelandic sagas, specifically the Voluspa. This is also where he gets Gandalf from some of these Icelandic sagas, or just the name Gandalf. The character of Gandalf actually comes from a particular portion of the Kalevala that deals with one of the sort of the big deities in Finnish folklore. So all of this stuff that he is reading is sort of going into a hopper in his mind, and he's pulling from this freely to create new languages especially. Now, during this time period, he's writing, but most of the stuff that he's writing is poetry that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what we would call Middle Earth or anything that's particularly fictional. Some of those poems are going to be kind of lighthearted in nature, but a lot of the stuff is just what you might call the average bit of poetry for somebody that's kind of getting into it. He didn't really like poetry very much. It took some of his friends pushing him for him to really get into it. Now, he's still not the best all-around student. By the time we get to 1913, he had to take what's called honors moderations, which were these big exams that determined where you sort of sat in the relationship to the rest of your class and whether or not you should proceed on. And he got second class, which is good, but it's not really good. This would be something like he got a B minus or maybe a C plus. He's not failing, but he's also not doing super great. But for his grade in comparative philology, he gets what's called a pure alpha, which is basically making a 100. And during this time period, he's going to have a meeting with one of the administrators at Exeter, and they look at his grades with him, and they're like, "You're not doing so great in the classics line." And he sort of explains to them that he's much more interested in this concept of these old languages, and the rector says, maybe you should switch over to studying English instead of studying classics. And this is going to be a big sort of break moment for Tolkien. He's going to switch over to the English track, and he's going to meet this gentleman. Now, this is a picture from much later in his life, but this gentleman is Kenneth Sissom, and he was Tolkien's tutor in English. And with Sissom's help, Tolkien is going to basically fall off the deep end when it comes to his work. And this is sort of the moment where the game is on. And with the help of his instructors and with his tutor's help, Tolkien really did find his niche. And this is a big moment because the papers that he starts to write are much more deep and much more impactful. He writes papers on phonetic changes between different languages. He wrote a paper on the usage of vowels and how they changed from Old English to Middle English. These are very complex pieces of work that he's doing at what we would call an undergraduate level. He wrote a paper on how the Anglo-Norman language influenced English, and this is a pretty big moment, right? A pretty big moment for him, because he sort of found his stride. And around this time, he's going to read something that is really going to impact him pretty seriously. And this gets back to the stuff that we just spoke about in part one, where Tolkien was very aware of his heritage from the Western Midlands region in England, and specifically the West Midlands dialect of these old languages. And he finds a writer named Cynewulf who wrote quite a bit of religious poetry. And one of the poems is this poem called Christ, but it's in specifically this West Midlands dialect. And this speaks to Tolkien on a personal level, but also on an academic level, because again, he had developed this love for the old English languages. But this particular stuff was from where his family was, right? His family had these roots in the West Midlands that had gone back, well into history, and he kind of latched onto this. And there's a line at the beginning of one of the stanzas that's "Hail Arundel, brightest of angels." And I mentioned this earlier in parts of the discussion, but this particular line with the name Arundel in it is a very, very powerful line for Tolkien. And in 1914, which would have been the first year that he was sort of studying this new track of English, he's going to write a poem that's called Arundel the Mariner. And this work in 1914 is the first piece of literature that begins all of the subsequent Middle-earth work. So this is when he decided that he was going to make a world. And he didn't know how big it was yet, and he didn't really understand how much he was going to put into it yet. And it's still fairly evident that early in his writing, he was on this journey to connect mythological parts of England with modern day, and to give what he called a northern Odyssey. He had read Odyssey and the Aeneid and Iliad and all these books about the Mediterranean, but there wasn't anything for Northern Europe. His people, his heritage, they needed this story that could unify all of their stories together, and he was going to be the one that did it. And Arundel the Mariner is where it all gets started in 1914. By the time we get to 1914, especially the spring of 1914, Tolkien was doing quite well. And the change in track was obviously one that benefited him intellectually, but also gave him a lot more fulfillment. And he also started producing a lot more work. He's going to win a particular prize for writing. This is the Skeet Prize for writing, and this came with a £5 bonus. So what do you do with £5? If you are a relatively lower middle class kind of kid that's at an expensive university, do you use that to pay your tuition? No, of course not. You use that to buy books. And a lot of Tolkien's teachers had hoped that he would buy books that they would suggest, but he went off and bought books that he wanted instead. For example, he bought a couple of books on medieval Welsh. He goes to buy several books that were written by Morris. And Morris was a very prolific writer who had written a lot of things back in the 1800s. And several of the books that Tolkien had read before were going to be important, and several of the books that he reads at this time are going to have a lasting impact on him. For example, one of the books that Tolkien buys with his prize is the Volsunga Saga, which is an old Germanic collection of tales that Morris had translated. He's also going to get The Life and Death of Jason and The House of the Wolfings. And The House of the Wolfings is especially an important book for Tolkien because one of the things that he's going to sort of absorb from this book is this concept of writing in such a way, fictionally speaking, that you portray a depth of time. And there's also a lot of description of landscape in these books, and there's also a word that Tolkien decides to just lift directly, and that is Mirkwood. So if you're familiar with the forest in Tolkien's work called Mirkwood, this is where he literally just picks the word up. And Morris's writings are going to have a pretty big impact on him because there are these sort of big battle scenes, and again, this idea that the world that the characters are exploring is one that has existed for centuries before. And these are very, very important books. So Tolkien might have gone and bought fiction that didn't necessarily please some of his professors, but we as appreciators of Tolkien's work should be glad that he did buy those, because this is going to be some of the earliest stuff that really starts impacting Tolkien's writing style. And this vague sense of deepness and these walking by ruins that are thousands of years old, this is stuff that pops up time and time again in Tolkien's writings. He does have to eventually, wrap up his study, and during this time he's also going to read the Vinland Saga, which is another one of the older sagas, but this particular one describes the trips over to the Americas. This is written and collected by a guy named Thorfinn Karlsefni, but this is an older translation older collection that Tolkien then translates himself. And he's also going to be a little bit impacted by the particular area that he chose. So when he switched his track from classics to English, one of the things that he had to do was do a certain amount of work in what we would call modern English. This is not something that Tolkien was particularly fond of because, again, he's much more interested in the older English writings. Modern here being basically post-Renaissance. And he's going to start reading a lot of work that comes out of the Restoration period. So this is after the Stuarts had been put back on the throne. So this is from about the late 1600s to the early 1700s in England. And there were some very big stylistic changes that happened in England during that time when it came to writing, especially with drama and comedy. And there is an entire genre now that's just referred to as Restoration drama and Restoration comedy. And these works are very different in tone than a lot of stuff that you might expect from English writers. They're rather bawdy. Some of them are rather sexualized. They're very, very highly political. But what's interesting is that they're also very classically motivated. And this is something that Tolkien sort of used as a way to try to appreciate this stuff, especially the works of Benjamin Jonson and another writer named Dryden, who they were very big in the scene of the Restoration writing. And he uses this reference that pops up all the time in their writings to classic literature as a way to try to bridge the gap between them. And this is going to be an interesting addition to his sort of mental pantheon of writers. You don't necessarily see a whole ton of what we would call bawdy writing in Tolkien's works, but the political nature does seem to have some level of impact. So when we think about how different countries were ruled, and when we think about how different kings are portrayed, or how different cultures had different sets of expectations when we come to cultural things in especially works like Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, and maybe not so much in The Hobbit. It was written a little bit differently than the other two. But you're going to start seeing that there is a very clear political element in a lot of these. And that's pretty interesting. So this is all going to kind of go again in the larger hopper. And by the time we get to 1915, Tolkien is going to take his final exams and pass them with first honors. So this is a very important moment for his life, because at this time he had really hit basically pay dirt here. This is a really big time for him. Now, there is this interim where he has to go to the war, right? He joins the military and he's over in France by 1916. But even in the military, his speciality is signal officer. So if we look at what he would have been doing as a signal officer, this actually does have quite a bit of overlap with himself, academically speaking. Signal officers had to learn all of the codes. So they had to learn Morse code, and they had to learn how to do the flag codes and lamp flashing codes, and they had to learn how to encrypt things and use even stuff as like homing pigeons. He was trained to use homing pigeons. And he did fairly well at this and was able to get a position to be a signal officer. So this actually kept him out of some of the roughest of the frontline fighting. Now, he did spend a fair amount of time literally in the front trenches, but a lot of his work while he was deployed in the military was sending and receiving messages, making sure that things went through the right way. And he spent a fair amount of time sort of behind the lines, if that made any sense. And when he got sick and shifted back over to England in 1917, or late 1916, early 1917, he's going to be put in charge of teaching signal stuff. Now, he actually took an exam to be sort of a master signal trainer and ended up failing it. So again, he's very bright, he's very smart at what he does, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's always the best of students, which I think humanizes him a little bit. If you just look at his intellectual capabilities, it can get a little bit daunting to try to understand exactly what's going on in a brain that's working on so many levels. But he's still not the world's best student. Once he gets out of the military, and the war is over in 1918, and he had actually been able to organize a little bit of a positioning at the end of 1918 because he heard about a job opening. And the job opening was from this gentleman. This is William Craigie. And Craigie was one of Tolkien's teachers. And he had been very impressed with Tolkien's skill and ability, and ended up knowing somebody working on the Oxford English Dictionary. Specifically, this gentleman. This gentleman was Henry Bradley. And Craigie sends word to Tolkien that someone with Tolkien's philological background and knowledge of the English language would be really good for this particular job. And he sends word to Bradley that he knew somebody that would be perfect to help him with the dictionary. And Ronald's first job out of the military is actually working on the Oxford English Dictionary. And he starts working there in January of 1919. And the particular section that he is involved with, he's on a committee with another gentleman named C.T. Onions, which is an interesting name. But the section was the letters U through Z, and particularly Tolkien got the W's. So his job was to effectively write the dictionary entries for words that started with W. And it should not be surprising that he was absolutely fantastic at this job and used this as a lever to gain access to study other languages like Danish, additional studies in German, other old Scandinavian languages, and he really loved this job. The problem was that it was not paying him very much. And especially at this point where he had a wife and children, he needed additional money. So, well, what does he do? In the city where he lived, there were several schools, specifically Lady Margaret Hall and St. Hugh's School, and he put himself up to teach Anglo-Saxon. And this was not a full teaching position, but a lot of the students at these schools ended up showing up to his house to get extra lessons in Anglo-Saxon. And this is actually going to end up bringing him more money than the dictionary job, because it just turns out that he has a knack for teaching. And he's going to take a bit of a risk in 1920, and he actually quits the dictionary, which was sort of a blow to Mr. Bradley, who had really appreciated Tolkien's work, but Tolkien wanted to teach. He had found this love of sharing his knowledge of language, and he takes a bit of a wild shot, and he applies for a position as a reader in English languages at the University of Leeds. And he didn't really think that he was going to get this job, but he does end up getting the job. It's something that sort of surprises him, Of course, this means that the family has to move. That does put some amount of strain on the family, but it's time for him to go be a college teacher. Now, the position was not a professorship. It was just a reader. So this is a person that does a lot of the same sort of jobs, but they're not going to have the same level of expectation, and they're not going to have nearly as much power. Now, for the first several months that Tolkien goes to Leeds, Edith and the kids are still going to live in Oxford. And this is going to be something that has a little bit of strain on the relationship, because we mentioned, especially in part 2, how the frequent moving around was something that did not sit very well with Edith. But he's really good at his job. And the person that is going to be one of his biggest supporters and sort of his on-the-job trainer is this gentleman. We talked about him a little bit in part 2. This is E.V. Gordon. And Gordon is going to recognize right off the bat that Tolkien has quite a bit of skill. Now, it should be pointed out that the English program at Leeds was a very, very small program. There were 7 or 8, maybe 9 students total in the program. And this was not a very prestigious position, and this was not necessarily a humongous pay rise for Tolkien. But what it did was it gave him an opportunity to do what he loved to do. And Gordon figures out really early that Tolkien had something special about him, and he's going to tell him fairly early on in the early part of 1920 that it was going to be Ronald's job to set up a new model of teaching English at Leeds that was basically a copy of the Oxford model. So the way that Oxford universities taught English was a sort of a 2-track model. Again, you had your old English work, which is the Anglo-Saxon, the Beowulf, the Sir Gawain. Then you had your modern English, which would have been your Shakespeare and your Alexander Pope and your Johnsons and your Dryden's restoration work. And you would have to do a little bit of both to get your degree, but you would focus in one or the other. And Leeds didn't do it that way, but wanted to shift to that model because it was doing fairly well at Oxford. And Gordon tells Ronald, this is your job, go do it. And right off the bat, it becomes very clear that Ronald has what it takes to get this job done, because the enrollment starts going up. Now, again, this isn't the most perfect job for Ronald. He's doing what he likes to do, but again, it's not a whole bunch of pay. And he starts applying for other jobs. And unfortunately, this is something that's going to be a very mixed bag of emotions for him. He gets invited to apply for a job at Liverpool as a chair. So this would have been a big jump. But he doesn't get the job. And he sort of felt like that he wasted his time, and maybe even that the people that had invited him didn't really seriously think that he was going to get the job. Maybe he was just somebody that needed to round out the applicant pool, perhaps. So that was a bit of a bad taste in his mouth. And in late 1921, he is going to apply for a chair at the University of Cape Town. This would have been back in South Africa. So Tolkien was born in South Africa, and he had never necessarily planned on going back down there, but again, this is a chaired position. And at this time, Edith had just had a child, and sort of made it clear that moving again at this time would have been a bad thing, and Tolkien got offered the job, but then turned it down because he recognized how much of a strain that would have been to his wife and a newborn child. But it does seem like he regretted that for a while. He sort of felt a little bit of, I don't know, of what could have been, right? That nostalgia for something that never happened. And by the summer of 1922, the program had grown quite large, and the chair at Leeds decided to leave, and he applied for that job, and he was down to basically the short list, one or the other, and he didn't get that. And that sort of kind of ground in a little bit, but by 32 he had done such a good job with the program that he gets made a full professor. And that's a big mark. One does not get full professor status at 32 very frequently, if at all, in the English university system. This is a position that many people wouldn't have really ended up with probably into their 40s. You had to do a lot of work. You had to do a lot of academic lifting to get this position. But Tolkien had done that. He had grown the program remarkably. He was well liked by his students. He had overcome a little bit of initial judgment by a lot of people because he was very, very serious about what he did until he wasn't. He was a bit of a character. He could be very strict and very direct and very blunt and deliver some crushing reviews, but then the next day you might show up to class or a lecture and he had shown up dressed like somebody from a German play and would sing to you in Gothic. So you never really knew what to expect with Tolkien, and that rubbed some people the wrong way. But once you sort of got past the entryway, he was really good at what he did. And he had already started publishing some academic work, which was, again, something to be expected of people in his position. He and E.V. Gordon in 1922 published a Middle English dictionary, which was a lot of work, and it went to print in early 1922. And this was something that he really took a lot of pride in because he had published a few things prior to this, mostly things like poems, and nothing necessarily that would have been hugely academic. But, he's getting himself out there. And he decided to start work with Gordon on a translation of Sir Gawain, where Tolkien would do the actual translation of Sir Gawain, and then Gordon was going to do footnotes and help him work on the glossary. And that went into print in early 1925. So he's already making a name for himself, specifically in the field of academia, right? Because he's just really good at what he does. By the 25-26 school year, Ronald makes a change in teaching, and he is going to move from Leeds to Merton College. And here is a picture of Merton College. So you can just sort of imagine this is probably very similar to what it would have looked like when he was there. And Merton College is part of the Oxford system. And this was a big step up for him. He didn't necessarily know if he was going to get the job. He was probably, if we're being honest, a little bit pessimistic about his chances of getting on at an Oxford university. But he got the job. And right away, he sort of hits the ground running. So his first contract was to give 36 lectures a year, which is fairly standard, right? So from the beginning of the school year to the end of the school year, he was expected to give 36 lectures. He gave 136 lectures because he had stuff that he wanted people to know. He had information that wanted to get out there. And for just about his entire teaching career, and all the way through the end of the 30s, he always gave at least twice as many lectures as he was required to by his contract. So he was avid about teaching. He knew what he wanted to say. He was very excited to say it, and was a workhorse, just an absolute workhorse. And when he got to Merton and sort of in the larger Oxford system, he really wanted to push his love into the curriculum. Specifically, he wanted to add Icelandic or Old Norse, and he wanted to make the students in the English world, regardless of whether they were in the Old English or the modern English paths, take ancient writing and reading lessons. So even if you were, for example, studying Shakespeare and you wanted to get a modern English degree in the Oxford system, he wanted you to take lessons and be proficient in reading and writing an ancient language, because to him, you couldn't really understand Shakespeare unless you understood the language that Shakespeare was using, and you couldn't really understand Alexander Pope if you didn't understand the language that he was using. And you can see right away that a lot of people pushed back on this, and his first attempt at changing the curriculum failed rather miserably. And so he does this like right away. He shows up, and in the first year that he's there, tries to change the curriculum, and that just didn't sit very well, right? The newbie doesn't come in and get to dictate terms, but he's still going to start doing or continue doing academic publication. In 1926, he finishes a translation of the Pearl. This is something that he had started back when he was working at Leeds, but he's going to finish it. And what's interesting here, and this is something that is going to become very, very sort of familiar with Tolkien's process, he finishes his translation and asks people if they want to publish it, and they say, yeah, we'd be interested. You need to write an introduction, and then he just sits on it because he doesn't know how to write the introduction the right way. He wants to make sure that he gets it done the right way. So he's got a full translation of the Pearl and then just sits on it. This is not going to happen once in Tolkien's life. This happens about a dozen times. He's also going to start working on just a whole ton of other academic writings. He publishes an article on Ankren Visse, which is a document that is a medieval instruction for monks. It's basically how you should live your life if you're being part of this monastic community. So he translates part of that and publishes that. He's going to start giving some very, what we might call high-profile lectures. For example, in 1931, he's going to present a paper to the English Philological Society on the Reeve's Tale, which is part of Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. And this hits off really, really well. And so much so that the lecture gets published in full in 1934, with additional notes that Tolkien added about the work itself. So people are even, at this point, publishing his papers as single volumes. This wasn't like he gets the paper published in a journal or something like that. They're publishing his stuff standalone, which is kind of crazy, right? It's hard to imagine that. Around this time, he's going to start a friendship with this lady. The lady here. This is Simone Dardenne. This is actually Priscilla Tolkien, Ronald's daughter. Simone Dardenne was a writer that was doing a lot of stuff in older French languages, and specifically was working on a translation of the Life and Passion of Saint Julien. And during Simone's work with that, she's going to run into kind of Ronald's works on older pieces of continental literature, and they're going to strike up a friendship and actually do quite a bit of work together. Unfortunately, not a lot of it ends up getting published. This is another sort of stuff that he does a lot of work on, and then never sort of follows all the way through to get completely published rather, not punished. Goodness. In 1934, in the early 1930s, he's going to start working on a rather ambitious program to translate and compile all of Arthurian legend into alliterative verse. So this, again, alliterative verse pattern is one that he had a lot of exposure to going all the way back to when he first read Beowulf. And translating an entire body of Arthurian legend into verse, modern English alliterative verse, that's just an enormous body of literature. That's particularly ambitious. And this is put together under his title, The Fall of Arthur. And he works on this for years, but by the time we get to about 1934, it's pretty clear that he just either ran out of time or ran out of ambition to try to finish that. What he did finish has actually been published after his death. You can get a copy of that. It was published with additional notes by his son Christopher. So if you want to read the work that he managed to get done prior to stopping, you can actually read The Fall of Arthur. If you give that a web search, you should be able to pull that up pretty quickly. One of his most important lectures is a very, very famous lecture of his that he gave on November 25th, 1936 to the British Academy. So this is Beowulf, the Monsters, and the Critics. And this was probably the most impactful piece of work on Beowulf that had been written or talked about in years. And it was incredibly well received. It has been published and republished multiple times. It got published in 1937. It is still today highly influential in the field of Anglo-Saxon studies. And if you are interested in studying Beowulf and read modern people that are commentating on Beowulf, you're going to find references to Tolkien's lecture here. This was one of the most impactful academic moments that he had. And if we look at his life, this isn't necessarily surprising, right? He had been involved with Anglo-Saxon work, and especially like with Beowulf, going back at this point 30 years, right? He had been reading this stuff in the original Anglo-Saxon before he was even out of grade school. And he knew what he was talking about when he gave it. I actually have a copy of this. It's from a very, very small print run. None of the print runs are particularly big. They're 100 or 150, and it's been reprinted several times. But I actually have a copy of it, and it's kind of a hidden gem if you find it original, because I've got the hardback version. Sounds like I'm bragging here. I should probably move on. He's also going to translate around this time another Middle English poem called Sir Orfeo. This is a really interesting work. It's based on the Greek tale of Orpheus, if you know the story of Orpheus. But in the late 13th or early 14th century, a writer is going to rework the story of Orpheus in Middle English, and specifically the story is going to get shifted a little bit, where Sir Orfeo has to save his wife from an evil king of the fairies. And this is a really interesting piece of work, and you can get... this ends up going on to be published, and Tolkien did fairly well on that and ended up bundling his translations of Sir Gawain the Green Knight and The Pearl and Sir Orfeo into one volume. So if you want to read his translations of these older English works, you can buy one volume and get all three now, along with notes and introductions and things like that he wrote himself. Still very influential in the field. He's going to be asked to. He's going to be approached after this point to start writing stuff. People actually seek him out to get him to write things, and a big translation of Beowulf was going to be coming out in 1940, and he was approached to write the introduction to that from a national publishing house. And all of this attention that he's getting is going to really pay off. In fall of 1945, he gets promoted to a full professor of English language and literature at Merton. And this was not necessarily a lifelong dream of his, but it was definitely a very validating moment in his life, because this was proof to him that he had not really been wasting his time. If you know anything about 1945, by this point, The Hobbit had come out and had sold very, very well internationally, had gone into multiple different printings, and he sort of felt like his fictional work, which was born out of this academic work, had perhaps started to steal a little bit of his limelight. And it's very, very odd to say, and I don't know if I'm describing it the right way, but Tolkien would have considered himself a linguist who figured out that he needed to write stories to support his language, instead of being a person who said, I wrote a story and then invented a language to put in it. And that is a very important distinction that is something that I don't think a lot of people really pick up on when they read Tolkien, because you hear very frequently that, he's brilliant and he invented all of these languages for this world, but that supposes that he was a writer, then a linguist. But he would not have classified himself as such. He was a linguist that then wrote. And that's a really, really important distinction. And the reason we're talking so much about his academic work is that he was, in some ways, more convinced of the value of his academic work than he was his fictional work. And that bears out quite a bit with his hesitancy in many cases to submit fictional work for publication in the first place. We talked in part 2 about how it took the convincing of his best friends to even finish writing The Hobbit in the first place, because to him that was sort of added bonus to his larger world of academics. Now, this isn't to diminish the importance of his creativity. Part 4, when we talk about that material, is really going to focus very, very heavily on how he considered himself a creative individual and why that was so important to him. But we can't forget that he was an academic too. So this big promotion is going to be absolutely something that is going to really pay off for him. And I managed to find some pictures from around this time. So this is a picture of him in his office from 1937. And you can just tell, like, this guy is a writer and a reader, right? He looks like the stereotypical professor. I really like this photo of Tolkien. He's at his desk and he's working, and he's surrounded by all of these really great hardcover books in his office. I just think that's a great story, or a great picture there. So what happens to Tolkien's academic work after he gets popular? So we get to the point in the 50s where Tolkien has submitted Lord of the Rings for publication, and there's a very famous moment that I would probably be remiss if I didn't share, where Tolkien gets the first draft of Lord of the Rings back for basically his review. And a lot of the people had changed the way that he spelled things. Specifically, they had changed DWARVES to DWARFS, dwarfs instead of dwarves, and elfs instead of elves, and things of this nature. Dwarfish and elfish instead of elvish and dwarvish, or dwarven, right? And he exchanges some rather pointed words with one of the editors, and at some point one of the editors replied something to the tune of, well, this isn't the way that these words show up in the dictionary. And Tolkien's response was, I wrote the dictionary, put it the way that I put it. And this is a pretty famous exchange where he got to flex a little bit of the academic muscle when it came to the fictional world. When The Lord of the Rings begins publication, it comes out in various languages across the world. And in 1956, he gets a copy of Lord of the Rings translated in Dutch. And he knew Dutch. And he wrote an entire ream of corrections to the person who had done the Dutch translation that basically ends with him chewing out the Dutch translator for messing up entire passages of the work. Because, again, he was a linguist that turned into a writer. And the ability to go, hey, you got hired by an international publishing company to translate my work and you did it wrong. Let me fix what you did because I know Dutch better than you. He did a similar situation with the Swedish version. The Swedish version had a introduction that he just absolutely hated. He didn't care for the Swedish translation very much either, and he had a rather heated exchange with the publishers of the Swedish version to get them to change certain translations and to remove material from the foreword. Especially part of the foreword in the Swedish version included a note from someone that was doing the translation that Lord of the Rings was mostly an allegorical story, and this could not stand. He effectively called trump cards on them until they recognized that they weren't going to be able to publish his book again until they took that forward out and made his corrections. So he was still sharp on his academic game, and this did somewhat comically play out with his academic world. But he's also still doing academic work this whole time. In 55, he gave a very, very influential lecture on the relationship between the English language and the Welsh language. And he's still going to get called to do quite a bit of public work. And one of his more sort of heartfelt calls was that he got called to give the valedictory speech at Oxford in 59. And he chose to speak on the topic of progress and degeneration. And this gets back to what we mentioned quite a bit in part one. Tolkien, even as an academic, was not a fan of progress for the sake of progress. He saw a lot of the stuff that was happening around him as not actual progress, but degeneration. And this is going to eventually be something that he kind of gets known for around the academic world. And by the time he's, this age, this is a picture of him from 55. So in the same office, obviously, but a little bit more advanced in age. But he knew what he wanted to say. He had a voice. He was very secure in his academic nature, and he didn't mince words. And this is another part where, some people sort of maybe consider him a bit bristly or a bit too stuffy. And if anything, that was just, he knew what he meant. He was not one to mince words or to be passive aggressive. He just sort of said what he thought and was exacting when he said it. He had an incredible precision of language. And that came from, of course, his academic background. Now, by the time that a lot of this stuff starts going, he had kind of wound down a lot of his writing, and especially by the early 60s, most of the stuff that he's doing is revision work. And he revised quite a bit of Lord of the Rings. There are multiple editions of Lord of the Rings that had quite a few versions that needed to fix this or needed to fix that, and he added appendices and tweaked maps and did all of that kind of stuff. So on the later part of his life, most of the writing that he was actually doing was more academic in many cases than it was new fictional work. One of the things that is going to be really interesting is that this is going to lead him to being chosen for a lot of academic work, right? So one of the things that he gets asked to do is write a preface to a work by George MacDonald called The Gold Key. This is going to end up being an interesting moment because in his introduction to MacDonald's The Gold Key, he really goes into how stories should be written and talks about why this particular book was so important and why the structure of it was so good. And this is sort of showing how Tolkien's academic stuff and his fiction stuff was almost one and the same in his mind for a lot of the times. He starts writing, this is how you should write a story. And he starts kind of writing the beginning of a story. And he realizes as he's writing the beginning of this story that he's actually writing a really good story. And he kind of abandons writing the preface to The Gold Key and ends up writing one of the last original works that he ever gets published. He starts getting a lot of recognition, of course, when The Lord of the Rings blows up. It sells so many copies, right? It's just absolutely blowing up. It's 30-something languages, tens of millions of copies. And he starts getting a lot of accolades. And specifically, a lot of people start wanting to give him honorary degrees. And he's very conflicted about how honorary degrees are going to work. And he starts getting rather conflicted about what exactly he has done to get these honorary degrees. And he's wondering, am I getting these because I'm a fiction writer, or am I getting these because I'm an academic? And, for example, he gets an honorary doctorate of letters from National University in Ireland, and he gets another one from the University of Liège. He gets a fellowship at Exeter and a fellowship emeritus at Merton when he retires. This is in 1963. He gets a CBE, which is a title in England. It's the Commander for the Order of the British Empire. It's basically one step below Sir status. He gets to meet the Queen in 1972. And he always sort of wonders, like, is this because I wrote Lord of the Rings, or is this because I'm an academic? And one of the things that happens right at not too far from the end of his life, he ends up getting a doctorate of letters from Oxford for philology. Now, of all of the degrees that he got, this one is the one that really meant the most in a lot of situations for him, because this was for his academic work. It wasn't just because he had written this fabulously popular book. It was because he had advanced the study of philology and language. And that meant a lot to him. And he was still very active academically all the way through. Here's a picture of him. I believe this is from 1971, so just a couple of years before he passed away. But, you know, still wearing the hat and dressing up and you know, got his umbrella there and doing his thing, right? So he's still quite a bit involved in the academic world, even all the way through his life. So while many people know Tolkien as that guy who wrote The Hobbit and that guy who wrote The Lord of the Rings, I hope that this particular discussion has showed how his academic work not only laid the groundwork for his later fictional work, but in many ways was impossible for his fictional work to exist without. These were essential parts of who Tolkien was as a person. The work that he did as an academic was almost well, I don't even really know how to say this other than saying if he was not the academic that he was, he would not have been the writer that he was. And his love of language and his love of history and his just voracious appetite for learning everything that he could is sort of a hallmark of who he was as a person. And this might explain more for those that have read Lord of the Rings and maybe have commented, why is this so long? Or why is there so much detail here? Or why does he go on and on about this? Or why are there so many passages of poetry? I just want to read the text. Because all of that was important for Tolkien. And all of this was him being the academic that he wanted and writing the fictional story that he hoped other people would like. And I really appreciate him for that. So, all right, that wraps up our part 3 of our discussion here.